Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 92. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And for a show like that, what better guest to have than who we have today? We've got Jon Thomas, all the way from Sweden. How are you doing, Jon?
Doing good. Just got back into the country.
Really? You just got back into the country? Where were you? You were in the U.S.?
I was in the U.S. for a bit, visiting friends and family and stuff. I was there for 2.5 weeks. It's actually kind of an interesting situation because to be able to get into the U.S., you have to be a U.S. citizen. And then to be able to get into Sweden, you have to have a work permit. So because I have both of those, I'm actually able to go back and forth between the two continents, which you really can't do right now unless you have a residence here and citizenship there.
Oh, man. Yeah, I can imagine. I'm lucky that I don't have a job that requires me to bounce around countries because you would be in quite a situation right now if that's what you have to do for a living. I feel bad for a lot of people who do like BJJ seminars as part of their career because, man, like right now, that avenue is just dried up.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually quite a few people, and I think it just depends on where you're at in the U.S. But in the U.S. right now, there's quite a few gyms in the South that have kind of moved forward. It's really interesting, not to go too deep into that topic because I know it's a bit political, but it's very interesting seeing the different perspectives in different regions. Because in Sweden, the whole experience here is this is something that we only see on TV. Mm-hmm. It's like nothing lockdown. The gyms are all open, nightclubs are open. It's the entire, I don't know, Sweden just took this completely different approach than the rest of the world. So our training here during the pandemic has been largely unaffected. So it was a very strange experience being in Sweden during all this.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's been a pretty strange experience, I think, for everybody. Just everyone's got such a different context because, yeah, like you said, every government's response to this thing has been quite different. And just the way it's impacted our training across the board has been very, very strange. But anyway, while we're on that note, we should probably actually introduce you. I have the feeling that most of our listeners are actually familiar with you and your work. But just in case, why don't you go ahead and let us know who you are and what you do?
So I am a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I guess my titles, I won the worlds and pans at purple and brown belt. I've won quite a few opens at black belt. I run a YouTube channel where I teach a lot of training concepts and different techniques. I moved to Gothenburg, Sweden, 5 years ago. I was traveling, teaching seminars. I got an offer to teach at a full time at a gym here. And I have a lot of my own particular training modalities that I think work best for me. So I felt like being in a situation where I could kind of control my own training and then do periodic training trips and bring people through kind of fit me better than locking in at a major gym. Because I feel like it gives you more control over your own training. As well as I kind of came up in a smaller gym in St. Louis, Missouri. And that I think gave me a lot of groundwork for taking my own responsibility into my own development because I came from such a small gym. And I kind of always carried that through my career. So I think it just kind of worked out well for me here.
Why did you, what made you go to Sweden?
Well, I was teaching seminars throughout Europe and then I got an offer to be here full time. And it was a way for me to get paid to teach, which also allows me to get paid to train. And then it just kind of worked out to be here because it gave me the, as if I was to say, be at let's say I just went to Autos HQ, for example. If I was at Autos HQ, it's harder to make income with jiu-jitsu, right? So this gave me an optimal situation where I could make a good income with jiu-jitsu so that I could fund my own training, but then also have the flexibility to travel and stuff. So I kind of made a decision that I thought this would work best.
Nice. And who's your professor originally?
My original coach was Rodrigo Vaghi in St. Louis, Missouri. I was there until purple belt. And then at purple belt, I moved to Atlanta to train full time. I had a brief period where I worked in Washington, D.C. as well, and then I quit my job. But then I ended up moving to Atlanta, trained from purple to black belt with a mix of Cobrinha, Jacare, and Lucas Lepre. So I probably trained the most, I guess, with Lucas over Cobrinha.
Nice. But you're technically not under alliance currently, are you?
No, I mean, so since I moved there, I've never represented anyone other than alliance. So it's not like I have this tight allegiance with alliance. but generally when I compete, I still represent them. I have like a good relationship with like Lucas Lepre. I haven't talked to Jacare in a while, but like, I mean, I have a good relationship with them. It's not like we're at odds or anything.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, for me, I first became aware of you, Jon, about I'm not sure exactly how long ago, maybe a year or two ago, when Matt just wouldn't shut up about this Jon Thomas's guy's videos that he's putting out and how they're excellent conceptual breakdowns. And I thought, man, this guy's one of us. And I recall a while back, we crossed paths on that online jiu-jitsu summit that was done when COVID first started to break out.
I remember that.
Yeah. You were one of the panelists on, and you had your own seminar, and we had a separate one or two as well. And I've been meaning to chat with you for a while because I think that the way that you think about jiu-jitsu and the way that you present it is probably something that would really resonate with our audience, which is effectively a heavy emphasis on concepts and principle thinking versus just rote memorization of techniques.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And on that note, something that you'd brought up as a topic for the show, which I think is an amazing idea, is how to integrate new tactics into your game. So I think everyone can relate to this problem where, you see some new move and you think to yourself, man, I should start using that. That would probably work very well for me. And you drill it one or two times, and maybe you try it in sparring one or two times, and it just doesn't really stick. And a lot of the time, that's just because you didn't approach the whole situation with a plan. You just kind of did what made sense. And I think the challenge, especially as you get more experienced in jiu-jitsu, is it gets harder to integrate new things into your game. First of all, because, whether you want to or not, you sort of close your mind, unfortunately, as you get experienced in anything. And that's something that we all have to fight as we develop expertise. But additionally, when you get experienced and you're good at something, now there's expectations, right? I mean, if you're a white belt and you roll onto the mat, no one expects anything from you and you don't have any competitive advantage. So anything you learn is going to be new and novel. Whereas if you're a brown or a black belt, man, you decide you want to start trying to use a new technique, you're going to be like white or blue belt level at it for the first while. And it's hard to stick with something when you have better tools in your toolbox that you're much more equipped to use. So a big part of learning a new technique is accepting that you're going to be bad at it for a while. And that gets, I think, more challenging up the chain as you get more experienced. I'd be curious to know if you agree with that assessment.
Yeah, for sure. I think it depends on how you're setting up your training as well. Like for sure, if you say your spider guard is like your best game, you're like the best in the world at it, and then you try to introduce yourself to playing De La Riva and it's completely foreign to you, you're obviously going to perform much worse when you try De La Riva. So if you go into a regular training session where you're doing like normal rounds, then if you're measuring your progress for the day on your performance versus other people, which we all do, whether we want to or not, subconsciously, everyone's trying to like perform good, then it's going to be hard to commit to trying a new position because you're going to underperform, right? So, but if you set your training up where I always have like an intent behind my training. So if I'm trying to develop my De La Riva, I'll go in the gym that day and, I'll pretty much do only specific training from De La Riva. I'll start with the ankle and whatever sub position I want to work on. And my only training is from there. And for me, I've like completely wiped out the idea of like belts and performance. I'll roll with a guy who's like a world champion in my double sleeve and do great. And then I'll roll with a guy who's like a blue belt. And then he'll like have some weird, awkward movement that's like kind of foreign. And then like that can actually be a bit difficult, right? But then like closed guard works on him super easy. And then with this guy, so it's not even like, people always think in terms of belt levels, like, oh, this guy's a black belt, he's supposed to be this good. Like, honestly, it's just movements and patterns. Like sometimes when you go, people often have this experience where they'll train with a white belt sometimes. And like, you'll have a position that's working great, competitive level purple belt, and you'll go with a white belt and they can throw it for a loop a little bit because they're doing such abstract, crazy things that it can be confusing. I actually like that though, because I like to understand the positions to such depth that I even know those really erratic, crazy movements. But yeah, long story short, for sure, it's normal to feel that. That's why I like specific training so much. It allows you to separate that.
I've had that situation the same where I train with a black belt or a brown belt and they move the way I expect. And that's a very different challenge from training with an untrained person who can move in ways that are not smart, but it can still happen. And if you're not ready for it, then, what do you do? I mean, the thing is, white belts, man, they do the darndest things. They move in ways that do not preserve the alignment of their body. They dive headfirst into submission sometimes. They don't understand how to keep themselves safe. They're not aware of what positions you're supposed to do. And sometimes just being novel and unpredictable is a strategy in and of itself. And if you...
I mean, they'll usually not the reason that they can't win is because people have good guard retention and things like that. So ultimately they may fluster an otherwise smooth position, where you normally play that system and it's very smooth and everything's clean. You don't have to use much energy, but they may do some wild thing that makes you have to kind of be less smooth and a bit abrupt. And then usually people can fall back on their retention. I mean, I feel like what you're trying to do is develop understanding. So even if I go with a white belt, and I'm doing a collar sleeve system that works very well versus world-class black belts, if they do some goofy ass thing where they're stepping backwards in an awkward way, if it causes some disruption for me, I actually really like sticking with it until I solve that weird solution just for depth. And every now and then a white belt will do a movement and the whole rest of what they're doing is terrible, but that one movement can actually be annoying. And if you have a logical understanding of your own game, you can actually intelligently take that little move and add it into your system in a smart way. And you can actually learn from that,
100%, 100%. And I think that's a massive mistake that people make in jiu-jitsu. And you hit it right on the head earlier, where you talked about how you need to kind of remove this notion of belts and, essentially rank, because sometimes really good insights come from the least expected sources, including white belts. I mean, I've had situations where, I'll catch some white belt in a triangle or something, and he'll just do some crazy thing where he'll use the hand in the triangle to try to pin me down by the neck. I'll think okay, this is technically not a good idea, but man, if you don't expect it, it actually kind of works, right? There's a lot of weird insights you can get from the untrained, because although they're not skilled, they also don't have these habits and patterns beaten into them over the years. So in some ways, their mind is freer to try new things. And every once in a while, it's like they say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. And that is very much the case with white belts. I have personally learned a lot just by rolling with white belts and being exposed to these unpredictable things that I didn't think they were going to do.
I was hanging out with my buddy last night who's a brown belt, and we were talking about just basically injuries and how I got a bunch of injuries. They're adding up. He's got injuries too. Both of our knees, currently dealing with meniscus issues. And I'm just fuck, remember when 10 years ago when we were fresh blue belts, and you just go hard in the gym, and if you get an injury, it heals within a few weeks, and then you kind of forget about it because it doesn't linger. But now injuries are lingering longer now that we're older, and I'm more sensitive to different foods and inflammation and things like that. And we were discussing basically what you guys are talking about, where a lower ranked belt might offer you a reaction that you're totally not used to. And like you said, Jon, basically, the majority of the stuff they could be doing could be hot garbage, but maybe they do a technique that you actually see some value in, or they created an angle that you weren't expecting before. And it's funny how we tend to think about how experience is kind of, it's a positive thing. It almost becomes an attribute after a while being experienced. But in a way, I don't know about you, I notice now that I'm, basically at master's division age, and I've been doing it for over 10 years now. It's well, I'm more cautious in my approach to competition. And in a way, it kind of even holds me back because, well, I'm more aware and to be honest, more cautious with my body than I was at blue belt. And I have the experience, so I'm not as wild as I would have been as a competitor at blue belt. So in a way, experience is kind of an attribute, but in other ways, lack of experience can also be an attribute, whether, you're just kind of, like Steve mentioned, you don't have the same bad habits that maybe you've developed, or maybe you're just wild and crazy, or you're literally just ignorant to the injuries that can occur. And so you put forth more of a tenacious effort than you might, if you have like 10, 15 years in the game.
I would add on to that, and I would say that you see a really interesting situation when you look at the guys who are really experienced. Like once you've got, a whole bunch of stripes on your black and red belt, this presents a different problem because, and Matt, I know that we agree on this. Sometimes you watch these old dogs who are doing instructionals and you look at their technique and you're like, that's just not fundamentally sound. It's just not going to work. But none of your students are going to question you on it because you're this master at jiu-jitsu. And I kind of feel like once you get to that level of experience and the gulf between you and your students in terms of mat time becomes that large, people just won't question you anymore. And you get entrenched in these old thinking models. And before you know it, you wind up with these guys who they've been around forever, but they just haven't adopted anything new in the last 30 years. And this is, I think, one of the challenges you see when you're studying under someone who's really senior is it sort of comes across, at least from watching their YouTube videos, that a lot of these guys have a really closed mind and they don't always add things to their game like you would when you're more junior.
I think one thing that helps is working in phases of like what you're trying to develop, because you can pick a position and you can go infinitely deep on it. I find that by locking yourself into a position that you want to develop on, like, okay, I want to develop my double sleeve, and you define the training as I'm starting in double sleeve, I'm going to spar from here, then the depth of how much you progress will build based off of that position. So kind of the way that I see jiu-jitsu is that, like, I break it, if anyone's listened to my content before, I like break everything down into these like separate mini games, right? And when you're trying to like develop an open guard, you want to like develop like a collar sleeve, a double sleeve. You kind of develop each of the individual grips that you could have. And if you could imagine like your game is almost like a spider web, right? And then it's like you can kind of like pick like a part here on the right, pick a part here on the left, pick a part here in the middle. Eventually, as you kind of fill in the knowledge of each of those positions, eventually they start to get so large that they start to intercept with each other, and that creates kind of like an open game, right? So I think if you're really good at one thing and then you're always trying to build off of it, sometimes it becomes like you get diminishing returns, right? So then by picking like a random other topic, so like you have a good double sleeve, for example, and then going, okay, well, I don't know what to do if I have collar ankle. Locking yourself in that for a bit will make you start to develop that skill set, right? And then you develop a collar sleeve, right? On a separate thing, right? And you get good at that patch, right? And then you get good at double sleeve. Well, now when you have double sleeve, you can switch from double sleeve to collar sleeve really quick. And then from collar sleeve, you can switch from collar sleeve to collar ankle really quick. And then it starts to fill in the hole. I think one of the biggest things that I think gives people a hard time is that they're almost, a lot of people are trying to like build a game where they're trying to like imagine like, this is my game and I'm trying to build off of it. Rather, I think people should approach jiu-jitsu almost like university. It's like you have different classes, right? You have like English, you have math, you have like history or, whatever, and you just take those classes. So if people could, rather than trying to imagine their game as a whole, just imagine it as separate skill sets, I think that alleviates a lot of that tension in performance. Yeah, as you develop all those separate skill sets, then your game will not, like a normal roll just becomes automatic. Like for me, there's really no difference between how I roll and how a white belt rolls in a sense, right? In that all you can really do is when someone comes at you is like respond. Right. So the difference between a white belt and a black belt or just someone better than a white belt is that what responses come to my head automatically are more useful than what comes to a white belt. To a white belt or someone who's never trained before, when someone comes at them with their hand, they have an automatic response. When someone comes at me with their hand forward, I have an automatic response. My automatic responses are more useful because I've trained them over time. So if you develop all these individual situations and formats of control, then no matter how the guy comes at you, you'll have useful options. But like, let's say that you've developed, you're really good at double sleeve, like controlling both sleeves, one hand on each sleeve, right? If you're really, really good at that, but then the guy approaches you in a normal roll with his hands back and his leg forward, you're stuck chasing for the sleeve, right? But if you've developed a really good like single leg grip or ankle grip, then when he presents that at you, it'll be easy to grab it, right? So by isolating everything, it makes it, the normal roll eventually just becomes automatic because no matter what they present at you, you have some system that you can run in your head.
Yeah, I really like that approach that you take. You know how you sort of coined the term mini games. I really think that's an effective way to train. I've adopted a lot of that just watching the footage that you have, the way that you teach, because I think that it encourages predictable reactions from your opponent rather than, you know, just trying to do your techniques. You know, like back when I used to train at this other gym, I'll admit the training format and methodology was not exactly the most advanced, let's say. You know, you'd go in, you would, you know, it's kind of cringy, but you'd go in and roll to warm up. And then when it comes time to do drills, it's like, you know, you're not really drilling with purpose. You're more just drilling to get reps, which I think there is a place for that. But if we want to create, you know, reactions and actually understand what the goals are and how,
I mean, you need to have resistance. I think a good middle zone for people, because like, also, like, if you go in with like full resistance, then it's too much. You can't process it. So like what I like if I'm in like a development phase is more what I would call like conversational specific sparring, where it's like you have the options of like pause, slow motion, rewind, fast forward, where you can kind of like if I'm trying to develop a game from scratch, like if I'm starting in a position and, you know, let's say I'm trying to develop a double sleeve and I don't know much about double sleeve. Okay. I start there. And then as soon as I start, the guy like deadlifts really hard and I lose the position, right? Then that I identified a problem. Now we could keep going. And then I'm like, I'm all everywhere. And I get past and then bottom aside. But like, it's useful to, as soon as that problem happens and he gets out, I call it a sequence, right? Like one attempt of him trying to pass and or me trying to sweep and submit. That's like one sequence. Okay. So we're training and we run a sequence, right? So I start in double sleeve or collar sleeve or whatever position you're working, right? He tries to pass. I try to sweep, submit, go. Okay. We run the sequence. Okay. Now he got out. Okay. After he gets out, stop. Okay. Rewind. What happened? Let's go slow motion. See, boom, right here. Okay. The guy deadlifted, freeze. What do I do here? And I'll literally do this with my partner. Like, and I'll be like, okay, what happened here? How does this feel? Okay. Does this help? Does this help? What about this? What about that? And I play with it and look for a solution, right? Now, how you come up with the solutions, that's the main bulk, right? If you want to develop a position, you start in whatever, collar sleeve. I start there, I spar, and then the problem arises. Now, how you find the solution to the problems, that's the most important thing. And there's 4 ways to find a solution to a problem, 3 to 4. One is asking a coach, another training partner, or like, you know, if you're at a seminar or whoever, right? So asking someone. However, if you don't have access to someone who knows that position, which is often going to be the case, even if your head coach is like Rafael Mendez, Rafa doesn't like deep half guard much. I don't either, right? So I couldn't give you a good answer on deep half guard. So if you're working a position, and especially if you train at a small gym in like the Midwest or something, you probably don't have access to a world-class coach to give you the answers. So often that's not a reliable one. Okay, so if you don't have someone to ask a question about, then you can watch competition video. That's a major one. Competition video, or well, actually before competition video, you could go through an instructional. So, but the thing with instructionals is you got to find people that you trust their instructionals, because some people are great competitors, but I know, because I've known a lot of people who've done instructionals, where they'll be like, well, I needed to put more techniques in, so I just kind of made one up, or it was kind of cool. You know, so I spent a lot of my career trying to make techniques from instructionals work, and sometimes the guy explains it differently than he actually does, and that can leave you trying to force a square peg into a round hole, right? Where you kind of end up not being sure if it works right. So then that's why I like competition footage, because competition footage, you know it works, because if a world-class black belt got submitted with this move, he didn't want it to happen, right? So you can kind of be assured that there's some validity to this technique, right? So I watch a lot of competition video. The 4th one, which is what people should probably be doing the least in the beginning, is creativity, right? But that's where you get to eventually. Like if I'm, you know, world-class at this position, if I have a world-class collar sleeve and a position keeps occurring and I can't find out a solution to it, and I'm one of the best in the world at that position already, then you start getting creative and coming up with your own adaptations and stuff. But you need to utilize all 4 of those. So usually when someone's trying to pick a new position to learn, I would say the first thing is find your experts on that position. So say you're developing a collar sleeve from scratch. Find your experts, maybe Tommy Langaker, Nicholas Mergali, Espen Mathisen, me, I don't have a ton of competition footage of me using collar sleeve, but I have a lot of instructional stuff. So you find like your 4 or 5 people you want to listen to about that position. Okay. So you watch a lot of competition footage, you get like this broad overview of what the position's about, gives you wide perspective of what it's about. Then you're going to start sparring in a set parameter of starting in collar sleeve, trying to sweep or submit from there, and they're going to try to pass. And then you just keep running those sequences over and over and over. Every time a problem arises, try to come up with a solution, reference competition footage, asking questions and doing that, and just spend hours in that position, right? After you spend like 10 to 20 hours in that position, just arbitrarily, you're going to start to recognize all these patterns and problems. You develop that level of awareness. And then at some point, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, at some point, there's like, you could work on it forever, right? You could do collar sleeve for 1,000 hours if you wanted, right? And there's always another response you didn't think about, like we talked about with the white belt. Like there may be some weird response that you didn't account for. So then you start to get diminishing returns. So then it's best to switch to a new position. But eventually, after you run through like 6, 7 positions and develop all these, it's good to go back through again, right? So I'm always, anyone who follows my content, if you check my stuff out, if you look at my game a year later, if I'm working on those positions, it will be completely different. Like, so a lot of things I teach in collar sleeve now that I taught a year ago, I'm like, no, I don't do it that way anymore. I don't do it this way anymore because of this, because my depth of knowledge increased. But that's usually how I recommend people doing it. You just keep cycling through positions and going back through. But there's always more to learn.
Yeah, and I think that one of the nice things that you're touching on there, which actually is backed by science, is the idea that sometimes the best way to learn is to shuffle the deck and switch to new things. We've talked about it on the show before. It's called interleaving. And basically the proposal is that if you spend all of your time just on one discipline, you won't learn as effectively as if you shake it up and you alternate between multiple, possibly related disciplines. So instead of trying to learn like AAA, then BBB, then CCC, you would learn like ABC, ABC, ABC. And
absolutely.
And then you can start to see the connections between them. And of course, in open guard, especially, right, in one of your areas of expertise, one of the things about open guard is that it is so fluid that you kind of have to be able to have an answer for everything that your opponent does. You can't really just assume you're going to get your collar sleeve configuration that you want and be able to lock your opponent in place and force them to do the guard you want. That's a mistake I made in the early days with open guard, which is I would think, okay, I want to be like a De La Riva guy with this particular grip set. And I try to get good at that and force that to work. And it wasn't until much later that I realized, actually, you know what? I kind of have to let go of the control here because I can't guarantee my opponent is going to do what I want them to do. So I've got to learn other variations. And it's okay if I want to funnel people back to De La Riva guard. But if I lose the setup that I want, I've got to have another game so that I can bring the train back onto the tracks the way that I want it to go, right? And that's something that took me quite a while to learn, which is the importance of understanding diminishing returns. And when you're good enough at one position and now your focus should shift to learning other related disciplines. Now, a big part of what you're talking about here is kind of the idea of having purpose-driven training sessions where, you've got a goal for what you want to do when you go and enroll. You might even have a goal for what you want to achieve in an individual round. And I'd be curious to learn a little bit more about how you structure that. Like if you, for example, have some new novel hand configuration or guard that you want to play, like when you go in to set that up for yourself, what does the mental process look like? And how do you kind of like structure, okay, here are my goals for how I'm going to train this. Here's what I'm going to do. How do you make that work?
So this one's kind of a tricky one, right? So there's two things that matter. One is like you need to have like kind of a logical approach to how to learn it, but you also have to have inspiration and passion. So I trust myself. I've been training long enough, and I trust my gut and my understanding and what I'm inspired by. So that changes day to day. So if I'm on a huge like creative flow on the double sleeve and it's just like there's a lot of new shit clicking and I'm like, man, this is really evolving and I'm really fired up about it. And then I go into the gym and I'm working it, and then, in the warm-up process, we're kind of light rolling, and then some new collar sleeve thing starts to click. And I feel like that's like a really big thing for me. I might follow that lead. right? So I don't know when the next big breakthrough is going to come, because often the things that massively revolutionize a position will be weird abstract details, like, oh, palm down instead of palm up in this specific situation, right? But most of the time it's palm up. But now only in this specific situation, palm down is significantly better. And like, there's a lot of weird little things like, oh, okay, the knee pressure like this works really good here, right? And like, so I'll be working a position and I just kind of feel it out day by day. A lot of people can't necessarily do what I do because I'm in charge of the training here. So I have a very open environment, right? So I may go in and start light rolling and then just kind of roll around till I get the collar sleeve. And then I'm like, man, like this feels like what I need to work on that day. And then I'll go deep into that. And I'm watching video all the time. So if I watch video before coming into training and I get really excited about a position, then I may go, you do that day in class. So you got to follow your inspiration, because I could say, pick a position, stay on it for 4 weeks. Once you complete that, now 4 more weeks in the next position. You can do it that way, and that's fine, especially if you're inspired by it. But if you are not inspired about the position you're working on, that's, you're not going to do it, right? So I think you have to balance out functionality. So certainly pick a position and go in deep on it and work on it for a bit, but also follow your inspirations and creative flow. Because if you don't have that and you're not inspired, it's hard. Like for me, when I get on the mat, and I start working on something, people they gotta escape the room, because I'm just going to keep going for 4 hours. So,
yeah, that's a really good point, because I think a mistake a lot of people make when they're exposed to new techniques is they just assume that everything will work for everybody. And it's just a matter of choosing your loadout, basically, in terms of what you want to use. The reality is, though, there are mitigating factors. Of course, one of them is body attributes. Some techniques just work better for different body types. But another thing that a lot of people don't talk about is inspiration. And I've definitely felt this firsthand, where I see a technique for the first time and immediately I think to myself, this is something that I should be using. And if I have that moment, it makes it a lot easier for me to adapt and start using that in my game. And it just feels like I'm immediately better at something like that, because it's resonated with me at kind of an internal level, versus a technique where I look at it and I just think, oh man, that, I don't think that's for me. I've kind of learned to go with my instincts on this now, where when I see a technique and I, even if the instructor is talking it up and how it's so successful at the world-class level, if I look at this and just think man, that's just not a Steve technique. I've kind of learned to trust my intuition on that. And even at white belt, I was having those moments.
Yeah, I would say that that's where it's difficult, because what people want is just a straight answer. But
yes.
You can't get a straight answer on this. I think you need both, right? The two extremes would be there's the creative people who are so creative. I see people who are blue belts, inventing their own new guard, and they're wow, they're all out there. But then at the end of the day, when they spar, they're getting killed, right?
Yeah.
So you gotta you gotta temper creative inspiration, creativity, and logic and structure, and you need both, right? So if I get on a creative whim where I'm oh man, this is working for me, and and then I go test it on people and I thought it was working and it's not working, you gotta really reassess, maybe this shit doesn't work, maybe I need to and then in the reverse, sometimes I'll be this thing's not for me, it's not quite what I want, so, but logically I know it would probably be good for me. I might do it a little bit and see if the inspiration comes. So you kind of need, that's a hard one, because it's you got to find that balance between logical organization but also creativity.
Yeah. And I like what you're talking to about kind of creative restraint with more junior people, because of course we're all guilty of this. I mean, I remember quote unquote inventing techniques at blue belt level and thinking I was so awesome, right? And maybe I was able to get some false positives because I could make them work against other blue belts. But
yeah, for sure.
You abandon that pretty quickly, right? The standard for creating a technique is much higher when you get to black belt, and you've got to be much more diligent about it. The way that I would probably equate it is look at what's involved in doing a PhD thesis. If you are out there and you're preparing a PhD thesis, basically what you're trying to do is create new knowledge that has never been discovered before, right? You're ideally going to be the first person who's ever figured this out. You're adding new knowledge to the system so that other people can benefit from it. However, to get to the point where you can do a PhD thesis, you've got to be in school for years and years learning how this stuff works. You're not in there doing those big complicated studies when you're in second year university. Yeah. It takes a long time to build up to that. So I think it is important to make sure that when blue belts and such, when they get really creative, I mean, it's okay for them to be creative. Sometimes amazing things come out of blue belts. I mean, Sean Williams invented Sean Williams guard, I think, when he was a blue belt. But at the same time, the reality is there's a much greater percentage chance that you're going to create something that's fundamentally flawed. And at that stage in your game, you're probably best off trying to absorb information from experts rather than trying to create your own information.
Yeah, it's just the point of like efficiency, right? I mean, it might be that someone is a white belt and invents some crazy new guard that works out, but probability says no, right? So usually, absolutely, the start of the journey to mastery is first learn to understand what others have created. Don't be bound by it, but like understand it. As you start to develop a reasonable level of understanding, because it's just such a time-saving tool. Because like, you know, if a guy can make this system work well versus a world-class black belt, there's a lot of things about it that are functionally good. So take it, borrow the ladder, use it to get up to speed quick. And now that you have all that, you can break the rules. Then you can start going, okay, well, maybe I could do this. Maybe here you could do that. And like, you know, and you start doing that. So I think all positions function that way. So like right now, if I wanted to start developing a deep half guard game really in depth, I wouldn't just start developing it. I would like look at all the best half guard, deep half guard players out there and then try to emulate, learn the techniques they're using, play with it, spar with a bunch of people and get like competent at it. And as I'm starting to like perform very well versus world-class guys in that position, and I've kind of have like a good understanding of largely what the other people are doing, then I might start innovating a bit. So I think that process, if you could just imagine not doing it for jiu-jitsu as a whole, but by position, right? So it's like my deep half guard is in the infancy stage, and then my double sleeve and collar sleeve are in the, you know, PhD phase, and you do that by position, right? One of the big things that I think people do wrong in jiu-jitsu is that, and it goes back like you talked about, like with the, you know, rotating through like multiple positions at a time and like cross-threading, like not AAA, but ABC, ABC, like that. I think that is probably what most people do wrong. It's like they think that there's like this huge, like I get the idea, which is like, if I just only do A, I'm going to be the best in the world at A and no one's going to stop it. But like most of the people who become really successful as entrepreneurs, they have multi-skill sets, right? It's not, they're just the best at this one thing. Like I said, they're the best at like, you know, look at like I don't know, Naval Ravikant is a guy I like to listen to a lot. And they were on a podcast, they were talking about like, you know, you can try to be number one at something, or if you're in the top 25% at three things, you know, then you're probably the only person in the world who's in the top 25% at swimming, programming, and opera. You know, now I don't know how those three would connect necessarily, but like if you pick like, for example, me doing a YouTube jiu-jitsu thing, right? Like to become successful at that, you have to be good at jiu-jitsu. I'm very good at jiu-jitsu. Right, but there's other very good people at jiu-jitsu. But then you also have to be very analytical to actually organize these systems. That's another complicated thing, right? Because someone can be a great fighter, but not very analytical and rigorous, right? But then you also need to be like good with public speaking and like carry your voice well and be confident in front of a crowd and like that, those kind of things. Those three things together make this career mode for me work better, right? There's other people that are like the best in the world at jiu-jitsu, but they can't speak well and they can't do that, right? So similarly in jiu-jitsu, right? You can try to be like, I have the best spider guard in the world, but then like you might fight someone and they just never give you the second sleeve and it throws you for a loop. So by having like 3 or 4 skill sets, sometimes it's easier to do. And then as a bonus, you also get that boost from your learning. I've certainly, logically, it didn't make sense to me, but my experience has certainly been that when I mix up the positions I'm learning, the speed of everything goes up. Like I work on my collar sleeve, my double sleeve gets better.
It's very, very counterintuitive. And that's something too that I'm still kind of struggling with, which is that there comes a point when you are better suited learning other things in order to get better at the original thing. Right?
Usually by the time you get back to it, if you're working on collar sleeve in the beginning and then you're like, okay, I'm pretty good. You know, it's not perfect, but I'm pretty good. Then you do double sleeve for a bit. Then you do collar ankle. Then you do close guard. Then you do some passing. And then you go back to collar sleeve. It kind of stirred all this stuff up. And then like it allows you to come at it fresh again. And then usually you break through barriers you couldn't before.
Yeah. That sort of incremental learning, I find when we're discussing learning new systems. Like about a year ago, I started studying Keenan's lapel guard. Never used worm guard before. It always kind of interested me. And there's a lot of material, it's like there's tons of stuff, tons of different positions to learn and different avenues that you need to learn. And you need to know how to, what to do based on your opponent's reaction and how you can funnel their reactions and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I remember, the first time I sort of watched it, you know what it's like the first time you watch an instructional. It's like, it's just almost impossible to retain everything. In fact, it is impossible, especially when there's that much material. But then when you go and you try it and, something works and you encounter a problem and you encounter a reaction you expect and you encounter a reaction you didn't expect. And then, after you try it for maybe a week or whatever, you go back and you watch some of the footage again. And then you notice things that you didn't notice the first time, or you remember things that didn't stick the first time. And then when you go and apply it again in the gym, it's like a new layer. You already have sort of that base level knowledge, and then you can add new details and sort of build onto the system from there. So it's like every time you go back and sort of pay extra attention to it, you pick up new stuff. And I find that's a really good way to learn systems as well.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, something that gives them a hard time with learning a new system is that they're trying to define it too soon. Like they want it to be like super structured where it's like, okay, step 1, step 2, or if they do this, I have and like, it's all organized, but like, or like they're defining things like always have the knee this way, right? Or like always have posture. Like they're looking for these hard rules, but like, especially when you're early on in a position, usually trying to lock onto something, it'll mess you up more because you don't have a good enough understanding. Usually the way I explain it is when I teach a system, like if I teach a collar sleeve system or a double sleeve system, that's just something that I created in that moment as a snapshot to explain to people how I currently see the position. But like as soon as I make that instructional, I drop all of those things as hard rules. But people will learn what I'm showing in a system like, this is a hard rule. You always do this. And I'm like, no. Right now, I find that to be effective. It works very well, but it might be that if you do the opposite of what I'm saying, and then you have this other thing calculated in that ends up better. No one knows. Like things go because it's very, very new, and there's so many patterns. So like I always say, what I'm showing now, this is currently how I'm seeing it. This is currently what I find to be the most effective, but it will change in the future. If you're new to a position and you're learning it, the first thing you want to do is the first few weeks, like keep a super open mind and just get raw data. Just get a lot of mat time in the position. Like, oh, the guy like killed my leg and passed here. That's interesting. Okay, when I put my foot here, that's interesting. And you just want raw data coming in. And then as you get all this raw data, you start to notice patterns. But people way too early, they want someone to tell them like, oh, when you're here, you always do the knee this way. And then they have it like a hard rule in their head, like gravity, and like, you have to always do the knee this way. And then like the coach comes by and then they're like, I have my knee this way. I'm like, oh, no, don't do that there. And they're like, but you said always have the knee there. I'm like, yeah, most of the time. But actually, if his guy's hand's here, you can't do that. Right. Then all of a sudden it's like they held themselves back. So I always say when I'm teaching, take what I'm saying as like 80% true. It's like a guideline. But if you try to lock on it like a law of physics that's been like proved, that's perfect, usually you restrict yourself so much it's hard to get to see the full, like to evolve.
Yeah, that's a really, really awesome point, and something that I have been guilty of myself. I mean, I remember when I was new at jiu-jitsu, I was trying to figure out like, okay, how do I hold people down in side control? And I remember at some point my instructor said, oh, well, you put your hand here and you put your other hand here. And for a long time, I thought what he was saying was, this is the way it must always be done. Like your hands must be in these positions. And I didn't realize that, okay, in side control, like you can kind of have your hands wherever makes sense. It just comes down to context and what your opponent is doing. And I was looking for a hard and fast, like you said, basically like a law of physics answer that I could just hold on to for certainty. Whereas what I was getting was actually just an example of like, here are how in this particular situation, if you apply the principles correctly, you would put your hands here. But that's just one option. And just in this situation, it's not a hard and fast rule by any stretch. And I think a mistake that a lot of instructors make is when they teach students, they make it sound like everything is like an undisputable law about what you should do. Whereas in reality, there are core governing principles at play, and what you're showing on any given day is just a particular example in one particular moment. And I think that does make it hard for people to adopt stuff because they see this one example and they put way too much weight behind it in terms of thinking of it like a universal truth or something.
For sure. And I think jiu-jitsu is like far more complicated than people think. One thing that people often are looking for is like, they're like, I'll have people do a private, they're like, just like, what are the basic principles? Like, what do I need to know? You know, just like, what are the things? If I just understood that, I get it. And like, people like this idea of like principles rather than like details, but like, and it depends on what you mean by principle. Cause what I'm saying right now is a principle. But like in general, I don't like principles at all. Okay. I like positions and systems, because a principle, and again, it just depends on, it's a semantic thing, but by principles, what I mean is people are looking for things like always have base, like have like your, you know, elbow and knee connected, like elbow tight, always elbow tight, like things like that are like the most damaging thing for most people's jiu-jitsu, because there's always a counterpoint, and like there's so much abstract, weird way to do things. So like maybe the most balanced way to stand will get you ankle locked. If you know what a coyote or ankle lock is, if you deadlift and have a super strong posture, you're going to get ankle locked, right? But then if you defend it by doing a certain thing, it may make the Lahiba hook stronger and exposes you to a berimbolo, right? Yeah. So then like there's no fundamental principle that you can follow that's going to account for all the parameters. Like if the sole purpose was do not get knocked over, okay, maybe you could find a way that standing and these fundamental principles always work well for base, but the best way to stand may get you triangle choked. And the best way to stop the choke may get you tripod swept. So there's no fundamental principle that's going to connect all this stuff. Furthermore, it depends on the prerequisite skills you have, right? Like let's say that you have a really tricky bottom of side control reverse triangle choke, okay? Like there's guys who are good at that, right? Well, who's to say it's wrong if you know your position well and you know your opponent to let them pass so you can hit that and choke them out? That's legitimate, right? Like Majid Hage choked everyone out with his baseball bat choke, right? So it doesn't mean that like, now I would say where that might be wrong for the Majid Hage thing is if he's doing it in a way that he's guaranteed that if the guy knows how to defend it, he gives up such a bad position, it's non-recoverable. So you just have to know your game and know what you're doing. If I knew 100% that when I go for this Majid Hage choke, that the worst case I miss it and he ends up on my back, but I'm so good at back escape that I know I'm always going to get out, then yeah, you can do it, right? But if you know that your back escape's not good and you're going for it, and you know, if the guy knows this one trick, it's easy to defend, then you're making a poor decision. So there are no rules. You can literally do whatever you want as long as you understand your own depth of understanding. And that's different for everyone, because I can say, oh yeah, go here and here, and this is a great position. And then if the guy does something else, you have to switch guard. But if you don't know that other guard to switch to, that doesn't work for you. So it's all about your prerequisites. So you should focus on seeking to understand everything. And that's, to me, the best way to use your training.
Yeah, when I started teaching locally at a purple belt, and then started getting really into instruction as a brown belt, and I realized I was making this mistake where I would make these hard, fast rules and make these, it's almost like at some point you gain some expertise in something and then you think you know everything. And then you realize down the road, you're like, oh my God, like there's some cringeworthy moments in my instruction where I may have made these hard, fast rules and been like, okay, the knee always has to go here or whatever. And now I have gathered enough experience that I realize that these rules aren't really good things to stand by necessarily. And it's not good to teach everyone, oh, well, you know, when I play De La Hiva, I always want to point my knee this way or whatever, because
it's like,
you will sort of give people misinformation at times.
Yeah. Like could Bernardo Faria coach, Rafa Mendes, and could Rafa Mendes coach Bernardo Faria? How would that work? Like
completely different styles.
Right. Hoffa couldn't go in there and be like, no, Bernardo, what are you doing? You should be in De La Riva. No, Bernardo does deep half guard and he's great with it. Right. So he can't, like, it's like, that's often people will message me to like look at their match and give them corrections. I'm like, I cannot correct you and watch your match because I don't know your prerequisite skill. I don't know what you're trying to play. I don't know your prerequisite skills. It's impossible for me to look at someone and really be like, oh, you should have done this. It all depends on context. So when I work with people online, I go, okay, send me video of you sparring from collar sleeve. I'm going to send you the video set of the series that I like to run from collar sleeve. You send me video of you sparring from collar sleeve with the objective of, trying to play this system. Then I can analyze that and give you exact detail on how I would have done things different. But that's a very contained, isolated thing. But I can't look at someone rolling arbitrarily and be like, oh, you should have grabbed his sleeve there and gone to spider guard. He's like, well, I don't know spider guard. Well, I can't tell him to do that. Then maybe grabbing the collar was a better decision.
It's an interesting discussion to have for sure. I mean, I'm personally a big fan of principles and principled thinking, mostly because it gives you a tool to organize your thoughts and to kind of reflect and discover learnings that you didn't know were there. But the mistake a lot of people make when they talk about things like principles and mental models is they think they are rules, but they're not. They're guideposts or suggestions, right? There are going to be exceptions. To your point earlier, like it's not like gravity. If you're talking about the elbow-knee connection, it's a good thing to understand because in the majority of cases, it's probably a good idea, but there's definitely exceptions, right? I mean, heck, when you're standing up a lot of the time, you're not always maintaining an elbow-knee connection if the other guy is standing up as well. So there's always exceptions and context is everything. So
for example, with the elbow-knee, I would say certainly above 50% of the time, I do not have elbow-knee connection.
Really interesting.
Yeah. I don't think Leandro does either. It just depends on the circumstance of the situation. Now, the idea that, okay, if the elbow and knee is connected, then, and the leg is on the outside, it cannot go through to chase an omoplata or triangle, right? Because the elbow and knee is connected and there's no way to kind of phase through that situation. Like the leg is stuck on the outside. But then the De La Riva hook might become strong, right? Now that again, that's more what I would call like specific situation. In collar sleeve, elbow and knee being connected will protect the omoplata, right? In a specific situation. But in collar ankle, the elbow knee connection, I think is really bad. You want the leg straight. So that's what I think about more in terms of always specific situations, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's almost more in common about rugby and football than there is escaping mount and doing a triangle choke. Like they're so different. When you really think about escaping mount, what does it have in common with like completing a triangle choke? It's such a different skill set, right? So it's hard to imagine like how those two, I mean, other than like athleticism and like being fit and stuff, there's very little in common with those two like skill sets, right? So by defining rather, okay, in this position, these are the things that tend to work, and like always being specific in the information and knowledge. Because, and again, like I'm being a bit harsh on principles because principles is a broad idea, right? Like you could say often when the guy is tight with his elbows, it's easier to off balance, right? That's generally a true idea. And like you said, not always, but it does function as a good guideline that maybe will creatively, when I'm struggling in a situation, I may remember that idea. I'm like, well, it's hard to submit him here. Maybe I can find an off balance somewhere. And that can function as a useful guide to help me think creatively. And that's where I would like principles more. But like you said, I think people misinterpret that to mean like, always do it this way or always have your elbow knee tight. But like, I find that has pros and it has cons, but I think for the majority of people, it is a con. I see so many people approaching passing the guard locked in their head that their elbow and knee have to be connected and they look like a robot. And then they're stuck. And I'm like, dude, just push his leg down. And they're like, but the elbow. And it's like, just push the leg down. It's fine. So like as soon as you drop those restrictions, the whole game opens up and you become free.
I think a lot of that comes down to when people, again, they're getting dogmatic about these ideas where they think it always applies. Like an elbow-knee connection is great if you're trying to prevent your opponent from extracting your arm, extracting your leg, or putting something against your hip or your stomach. But if you're not in a body position where that is relevant, then there's really no need for an elbow-knee connection, right? That's why,
I think that's the hard thing is that
it's the nuance,
to a person learning. Yeah, exactly. That's the nuance, right? And so to the person learning, they won't preemptively know what the behavior that made that valid or not valid is, right?
Yeah, the way that I like to describe these things is, part of the reason why our show is called BJJ Mental Models instead of BJJ Principles is because a principle is usually prescriptive of behavior. Like if I'm putting forth a principle, I'm saying like, here's how you should behave. Whereas a mental model is more like a general block of knowledge. And when it comes to something like an elbow-knee connection, if I'm going to explain that, and I found that to be a very, very helpful teaching tool, it certainly made me better and a lot of my students better, but I prefer to discuss it in the matter of, hey, here's a particular mechanical way your body can work. I prefer to describe it that way than to say, as a principle, you must always connect these two. Because if you do that, then like you said, you encourage that dogmatic thinking. And I think it's better to, as you mentioned earlier in the show, to present this information objectively so that your student does not think that you're like giving them a decree about what they must always do and how things must always be.
The only principle that I'm fully believing that it kind of exists in all situations is the alignment concept. Well, don't get submitted is great, but I don't know if you're familiar with Rob Bernanke, but the alignment concept of posture, structure, base, which is it's what our system is kind of based all around. And at first it sounds almost oversimplistic and kind of rigid. But you bring up the example of if I take my strongest base and I posture fully up, then I could be susceptible to a Kyo lock, right? Like that's very true. So the way that Rob has sort of found flexibility in his definitions, and he's able to use posture, structure, base to define all situations, but remain flexible, is he basically says, okay, posture, structure, base is relative to your goals. So for example, if I take the strongest base and I have this like big staggered stance and then my opponent comes in, he Kyo locks me. Yes, I was in base, but it exposed my foot. Whereas, I could turn a certain way and hide my foot from the ankle lock, yet I could still be in base because base is relative to my goals. So maybe my goal is not to stand up as tall as I can. Or maybe a better example would be like, okay, my opponent takes reverse Dalihiva on me and they're starting to go Kiss of the Dragon. Well, one thing I could do to shut down the space in between my legs is I could drop to my hip as long as I have control of the free leg. But I am sitting down, but that doesn't mean I'm out of base because A, my opponent can no longer easily go under me, and B, I could still get back up. Like I'm still able to drive force if I want to. It's not like I sat down and now I'm not able to get back up again, or I've conceded the bottom position. So my thought with that, not to be like a bit annoying about it, but it's just like my honest perception of like how my mind sees jiu-jitsu, is that I think all of those decisions are being made based out of a knowledge of that position, right? So I don't think the structure of like, you can only know that if you know that situation, right? So, because what you're looking for is like a guide, kind of, when you're like, that's what people are asking for when they're asking, generally when people are asking for principles, like some sort of guide to help them like know how to go forward, right? But if you're thinking in general, I want to have base, then you get hit with the Kyoterra ankle lock. You only know about that because you understand the structure that when you're in De La Hiva, the Kyoterra ankle lock is something that is available, right? So to me, the core thing is understanding the structure of all these different mechanics in depth and with great depth so that you can make appropriate choices. But like, for example, when I knee cut, I have, and I don't know precisely what people mean by the word alignment, so this could be a semantic thing, but when I'm knee cutting, my lower body and my upper body are rotated in the complete opposite direction, right? Like my right knee is going to the left and my upper body is rotated extremely far to the right. So they're completely counter rotation, right? So to me, when I'm looking for a guiding tool, I have found that the more kind of things I'm trying to follow,
it actually starts to stifle my ability, because I might start thinking, well, I need to be kind of in, and again, I don't know what they mean by alignment. So I'm not suggesting that necessarily that's what they mean by this, but like, if I'm looking for something like, well, I need my body to be in alignment, I want my vertebrae in alignment, that may throw out that mechanic choice of rotating my upper body. And then that may actually block me from learning a mechanic that is extremely useful.
Basically, I guess the way that we would chalk that up is, if you were going to execute a technique where your hips are turning one way and your shoulders are turning the other way, yes, that is throwing out the alignment of the, of your spinal column. However, you're doing it of your own choice. So if you're doing it of your own choice, that's different from your opponent imposing that upon you. So you could say being stacked breaks your posture because your opponent has a stack pass. They're putting compression on your spinal column. But you could also completely go upside down and still have posture, because if you choose to do that, if you choose to invert or whatever, technically you are in a position where your spine is not straight, and you're breaking that rule, but it is relative to your goal and it's not being imposed upon you by your opponent.
So what you're talking about here, Jon, and I think this is a fascinating problem that people have trouble getting their heads around, is balancing high-level concepts versus low-level concepts. So basically like the big lofty ideas versus the details. And in order to be truly successful at something, you need to kind of have those both at the same time. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make when they're talking about big ideas like principles or concepts is they think that, if I just only knew the concepts, then I'd be 100% awesome at this. But the reality is you got to roll up your sleeves and actually do the work and do jujitsu, right? It's like the example I give is like, imagine you've got a baby and you want to teach it to speak English. Are you going to sit down and like lecture the baby about the rules of grammar? No, you're going to give the baby a word and then a bigger word and then a bigger word. And eventually at some point you can start introducing the concepts. And I think the same thing applies here, which is that all of the concepts in the world don't mean a thing if you don't have practical, detailed experience so that you can actually see how these things relate and so that you can understand the exceptions. Like alignment is a great example, right? Alignment, yeah, sure, it talks about all of the right ways to control your body, but there's times when you might want to violate that, right? Like if you're desperate, if you're down on points, you might want to do something like a flying armbar, or you might want to bait your opponent with a submission. These kinds of things require breaking alignment in the goal of manipulating your opponent or getting a flash win. And those are valid strategies, right? So I think when people get too overly committed to big ideas, sometimes they forget that like rules are made to be broken. And something that you talked earlier about is being bound by rules. And Bruce Lee has this amazing quote where he says something to the effect of, obey the rules without being bound by them. And I think that's a great way to think about it, right? Which is like, these things are guideposts. They're helpful in a lot of times as general concepts, but they're not applicable 100% of the time. They're a good guidepost, but at some point you've got to understand when it's time to go off the path.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, principles, again, depends on what people mean by principles, but those kind of principles like alignment, structure, they're more interesting from a after fact observational thing to me rather than a guide. Like if someone were to do like a BJJ Scout breakdown of me sparring, they would probably notice all of these things going on and try to abstract principles from it, where like they would be like, oh, Jon kind of always has this leg structure that creates but in my experience and my lived experience, it would just be, I'm in collar sleeve. In collar sleeve, I know he can do this, he can do this, he can do this, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. I'm in double sleeve, I can do. So it's like, for me in my head, like someone, if they look at me on top, they're like, man, Jon's balance is insane, right? He must just have like principles for balance that are so far. No, I know every grip that the guy has, and I know exactly where to put my foot and when and why. And I know every detail to like everything that I do. It is all exact with reason, right? Mm-hmm. And so if someone like were to do kind of almost like a scholarly observation of my game on a macro level from a distance, they might notice something like, oh, his foot is always in this alignment with his leg. But like, actually, I didn't arrive at that from that format of understanding. I arrived at that from understanding individual positions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to me, to make someone progress, it is the most useful way, because you always have, anytime you give these hard rules, you have to give so many caveats, it gets confusing, right?
Yeah. I think principles are very powerful as a tool for reflection, right? Because to your point,
exactly.
Without having something to reflect upon, if I just tell someone a principle, it's kind of hard for them to actually visualize how that comes into play. They don't have the firsthand experience to really know what it applies to, and they might read it the wrong way. Whereas if you've been doing something particularly, and then someone comes out and points out to you that, hey, you did this, and here's how that ties into other things, then that can lead to a lot of really powerful breakthrough moments. But without the detailed hands-on experience, principles are generally kind of lacking in value.
Yeah. The first point in agreement, I think, is that I think if you use the word usually with most all principles, that will help, because it's like not always, right? But they usually function better as creative considerations. Like, okay, I'm trying to attack in this position and it's hard to get a submission. Often when it's hard to get like a submission, like an armbar or a triangle choke, then they're more out of balance. Often, not always, but often. That's a so it may help, like, oh yeah, it's worth considering, that like may help you creatively. But I think, and I really want to harp on this, that I think, it seems like when you guys talk about these, you're always giving that caveat with people to understand this is just more like a guideline. But to a lot of people, it's not just, in my opinion, not helpful. I think it can be the most damaging thing. It's like not just zero, it's negative, because
interesting
of the situation. Yeah, but again, that's again, you guys are giving the caveat of like consideration, because people like the passing is one of the easy ones I can always point to, is like people walk into the guard like they're a robot, and they're like stuck with their elbow knee tight, and they're kind of like, you can see it's like restricting them. Whereas when they just learn an individual position like collar sleeve or double sleeve or collar ankle, and like they just start with that grip set, and they just learn kind of what can happen in that grip set. Okay, I have collar ankle. Oh, when I'm here, he can estima lock me. When I'm here, I can get knee cut pass. When I'm here, I can knock him over. And all these weird abstract things start to come together. And then you start to notice how they all fit. You notice how the ankle lock, the balance, and all these weird things that are completely uniquely, set for that grip set, you start to understand. And then you really have depth of understanding. And then you tackle each position, and then that starts to combine it all together, right? And like, to me, it's almost analogous, like looking for principles that connect baseball, swimming, and like skydiving, right? Like, what would be the connecting principle there, right? And I feel like maybe that's more different than, jiu-jitsu, but like I don't know what connecting principles there would be with mount escape and finishing a triangle choke. It's hard to find it for me. Mm-hmm. So I find there is some for sure. Like if you keep your head up, like, versus like down, probably your balance might be a bit better, but there's probably also
but not always. There's tons of exceptions to that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why, like, and again, that's like a usually thing, right? But again, that's why I think it's interesting to me sometimes to notice those macro trends from an after perspective. But usually in the process of getting someone to understand something, it's usually case specific. Like my guard retention got so good, and I realized this kind of retroactively, was I started in judo. And in judo, the only time they let us do grappling, which is what I really wanted to do, was when we did pin escapes. So in judo, they have different types of pins. Like they have like kesagatami, yoko shiokatami, tami shiokatami. Like you have all these different pin variations. So I developed very good mechanics of getting out of each different pin. And when I switched to jiu-jitsu, I think that's largely what led to me having good guard retention, because I had good patterns for every parameter that someone could put me in. And again, I'm not trying to like knock all principles. There is principles that are true, but be very careful with them, because for a lot of people, they can become very restrictive and hold them back.
Yeah, I think that, like I said earlier, that's kind of why I prefer the term mental models, because it's better, I think, to describe the mechanics or the strategy of how something works and just be like, hey, these are how arm joints work versus trying to like provide guidance to say like, always do this in this particular way.
I think that's a good point. Like understanding how an arm joint works, that is actually specific, right? But that's useful, right? If you understand how, like, model is, like you said, is a good word, right? Like if you understand how the arm joint works, right? You understand that. Then when you understand how, an arm bar works. Like if you actually didn't understand how an arm bar, how an arm joint works, then when someone shows you an arm bar, you're like, well, why does that matter? Right? Like, it matters because you understand that the arm joint doesn't work that way. So
yeah. I mean, a very simplistic example, but of course you can scale that up to more complexity.
I think it's a great example.
It's interesting. There's this awesome website called Farnham Street, and they talk about all of these different like models for thinking. And the one that they harp on as being the most important is to understand that the map is not the territory. And what they mean by that is like, okay, this mental model that we're giving you is an idea, but it won't always manifest exactly like this in reality. And the idea is still helpful, just like a map is still helpful, but it's not 100% accurate to the actual ground it's representing, right? There's differences. Yeah. And it's very much the same in jiu-jitsu where we have these mental models and these concepts that we can talk about, but on the ground, you still need to have that freedom of thought where you can pivot and make decisions that might violate these rules when it makes sense. Now, I guess I have a closing thought here. We've talked so far about like the different tools we can give people to adopt new tactics, how principles play into that versus actually getting on the ground and using techniques. I'd like to turn it the other way around and ask, from the standpoint of an instructor, what can you do or what should you do to make it easier for your students to learn new tactics when maybe they're entrenched in a particular game plan and they're kind of in a rut, they're not learning new things? Are there any tricks or hacks that as an instructor you can provide that would help other instructors make their students better learners?
I mean, I feel like that question is almost beyond jiu-jitsu. It's like whenever you're talking about like formatting classes and teaching and stuff, it becomes very complicated because it depends on the goals. Like if the goal is to make the class like financially profitable, so more people show up, versus create like good competitors versus create people who, are something in between. And like, it all depends, right? So I'll tell you how I run my class and my goals, and then you can take from that what you will. For me, most really high level competitors I see are not made by their coach. They are built by themselves. If you look at Atos HQ, almost all of the competitors from Atos HQ are not from Atos HQ, right? Like I can't even name one, right? They're all from another gym, right? And usually what happens is people get motivated in their, like me. I started at a gym, it was not like a modern high level competition gym. There was no open guard really taught. I taught it all to myself, won the Pan Ams, and then moved myself, I seeked it out, right? So because that's kind of the view I have about it, I try to create my classes with a very open environment so people can come in and work on technique as long as they want. If they want to push hard, then we have time set at the end where they can set up rounds to push hard with people that want to push hard. But I leave a lot of flexibility and open room for people to pursue what makes them passionate because it's different for different people. If I set the class up to like push hard, then like certain people are coming in, they want to train 3 days a week and they get sick of it. And then like other people want to push hard, So I try to leave the openness. I really utilize speeches with the class a lot. That's super important. If you train with my guys, they all hear me talk all the time about they need to seek out their own understanding, use me as a guide to help them understand these positions, but they're all on their own quest to understand these positions, right? So whenever someone is in a rut in their game, I'm always defining, okay, well, what does that mean? What position do you not understand? And then I may pick a topic for them. If they're struggling figuring out how their whole game fits together, I'm like, oh, well, if you had a double sleeve, that would help your game a lot. So let's work on double sleeve for a month. And then I'll give them some content. I might send them some video on it, and then they'll work on it for a bit, and then they pursue their own pursuit. But I have a very much a hands-off approach with my students where I'm there, I give them ideas, but then I kind of more act as a guide and let them pursue the positions they need to work on. And if they need advice on what position they should work on, I give it to them. And then I help them out with their questions in class.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really awesome point, which is that a lot of the time these overly structured classes, they don't really give students the freedom to choose their own path. I mean, I've never liked that where it's like the instructor comes in and it's like, we drill these techniques and then we do exactly this and then that's it. I also like what you talked about regarding the importance of using speeches. And I think this is something that is underutilized. I think for some reason people frown on this, but I think it's actually tremendously valuable for the instructor to spend some time both at the start and at the end of class to talk.
Absolutely.
And to explain ideas, build a dialogue with the students. That in a lot of ways is far more valuable than the actual time you spend drilling techniques.
Absolutely. Yeah, your job is to set the culture, if I set the culture, like, you guys never lose, never fucking tap, never. You can like create a Cobra Kai culture at your gym, We're like, well, we don't tap, and like people get their arm cracked and stuff, and that's going to create a certain culture. If you create a culture of like, hey, we're all really into understanding jiu-jitsu, specific training, and you create a culture around self-understanding and understanding that you have a responsibility. Again, this is for more advanced people. I don't do this with people who it's like their first day. I'm not like, figure it out. You have like a certain intro level where you get them up to speed on like, fundamental controls. But then beyond a certain point in the more advanced group, then it starts to become giving them more of this openness. And I'm always instilling in them the importance of them self-developing and like pursuing their own spots of confusion.
Awesome. Well, Jon, thank you. That was a fantastic chat. I really appreciate your time. Any closing thoughts before we tie this up?
No, it was really good talk. I think it was really good. The conversation we got into with, principles and all of that. I think that was a very great topic. I don't know how much I've talked about that before, so I think it was excellent.
Absolutely. It was great to connect. I know Matt wants to chat again in the future, so hopefully we can make that happen.
I just want to say, Jon, I really appreciate it. I didn't even get a chance to thank you for the work that you've done, because I wanted to actually discuss it, but it's just the conversation just flew by. You're kind of integral in how I sort of relearned how to play the gi, even because I spent much of my brown belt years learning no gi mostly. And then when I went back to the gi, I never left the gi, but when I started, thinking, okay, I got to focus on the gi now that I'm a black belt, I realized, hey, my engagement phase grip fighting concepts are really not where they should be. And so I look to you for a lot of that. And I really appreciate it.
Happy to hear, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
talking no-gi at some point would be very interesting as well, because it's like I don't know if it's more or less complicated. I think it's super complicated because you don't have all the grips. Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting. Yeah.
Now, before we tie this up, any plugs? Is there anywhere that people can go if they want to see your content?
Yeah, you can check me out on Instagram at Jon Thomas BJJ, on YouTube Jon Thomas BJJ. And then DM me. I do online coaching and stuff like that. If anyone's interested, they can DM me on Instagram.
And you also just released a new instructional, didn't you?
Yeah, I released one through Stephen Kesting, like open guard concepts. I have one on the Grappler's Guide. I have a couple on the Grappler's Guide. I have a discount code there. I think it's J Thomas on there. And then I also have one through BJJ Fanatics as well.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, Jon, again, I thank you so much for your time. This was a super valuable chat for me, probably will be for our listeners too. So thanks again, everyone, for your attention. Talk to you next time.